Thank you, Oliver, members of the council and members of the commission and city council members. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come speak with you today. You're at the start of the periodic update process, and this is the start of a conversation where we're looking forward to working with you in this process. Today, I'd like to go over some of the basics, some of the most critical elements that you're going to go through, and my hope is to leave you with a good understanding of the process overall and some critical tools to help you get started in the process in the right direction. So, as you've heard, I'm Dave Andersen. I'm the Managing Director of the Growth Management Program at the Department of Commerce. Department of Commerce, we touch on every aspect of the community, including things like housing, infrastructure, and economic development. We work closely with local governments, civic leaders, and others to strengthen communities. And for all of us at Commerce, local governments are one of our most important implementation partners. And our programs support our partners as they work through many of our shared goals. And I'm so thankful for the work that you've done and so thankful for the strong partnership that we have with the county and the cities in Clark County. So I'm going to start with talking about, can you go next? I'm sorry, I'm not advancing my slides here. The next one. There we go. So I'm going to start with talking about why you would want to have a plan in the first place. What's the whole point of planning? These are some of the reasons why I think it's important for a community to have a plan. The first one is that you're making decisions that are going to last a long time. Land use decisions are largely permanent decisions. And also, many individuals and organizations are going to have to work together. You also need a plan when that happens. And you need a plan when you're going to try to accomplish something that's going to require persistent effort over a long period of time. You're going to be working with making investments in infrastructure that has long lead times and that lasts a long time and has a long payback period. And lastly, the public expects fairness and transparency in local decisions about land use. And the planning process, as you'll hear later, is really fundamental to providing that kind of fairness and transparency that citizens in a democracy expect. Next slide. So now I'd like to talk about some of the features that really make a plan a good plan. What does a plan have to really be a good one? And there are three specific things a plan must be. It has to be compelling, it has to be specific, and it has to be realistic, okay? It has to be compelling enough that it really represents where the community wants to go. You'll find this in the vision, you'll find this in the goals and policies. That's where we're trying to get to. The plan must articulate a compelling vision for the future. Second, it must be realistic. It must be grounded in enough empirical fact that you understand what you have to work with. And lastly, it must be specific enough that you know how you're going to achieve it and whether or not you're actually implementing it or not. If you've never said no because something in your plan didn't agree with what you wanted to do, your plan's probably not specific enough, okay? Plans help you make tough decisions and helps make sure that you're making those decisions in a way that is moving you toward a goal, sometimes a goal that you may not live to see. But that's the purpose of a good plan, okay? You know it's a good plan not by looking back 20 years from the future. You know it's a good plan because it's helping you make good decisions today. If I had to describe good planning in 2 words, these would be those words: disciplined imagination. That's the plan. That's planning in a nutshell. Next slide. So every state in America has got a land use planning framework. Okay, local governments are creatures of state law. Planning is largely governed by local governments. So the state planning framework is largely what governs planning in America. And every state operates a little bit differently. Across the border in Oregon, it works a little differently. Across the border from where I live in Idaho, it works a little differently. But Washington this is Washington's planning framework. We've got the Growth Management Act. That sits within the other planning laws in Washington state, things like the Subdivision Act, the Shoreline Management Act, the Local Project Review Act. Those sit within lots of other laws that govern how cities and counties work, govern things like annexation, govern things like taxation, property tax allocation, and all those sit within the framework of both the state and the federal constitution. So all this together constitutes the laws that govern planning in Washington. And the Growth Management Act, I work for the Growth Management Program, and there's the Growth Management Act, which is 3670A, but that's not the whole picture. And oftentimes, although there's a piece of law called the Growth Management Act, most of the time when you hear people talking about the Growth Management Act, think about it not in terms of that law, think about it in terms of the whole enchilada, the whole framework is really, that's usually what we're working within. Next slide. And every planning framework, there's a couple of things that need to be balanced. There are two expectations that the public has of the planning process. And if you've been in local government any length of time, you've probably heard both of these. First one is, this affects my home, this affects my neighborhood. I should have a say in what happens. An expectation that the process involves a broad array of participants, that it is a deliberative process, that it takes into account lots of different perspectives. That's one expectation. The other expectation is, I just need to get my permit. Tell me what I need to do. I need to have certainty. I need to have finality. And these two goals exist in tension. And one of the things that your planning laws need to do is try to resolve this tension, okay? And Washington has taken a particular approach to how we resolve this tension. And it relates to the comprehensive planning and the development regulations, the legislative decisions that city councils and county commissioners make. What are the rules? And then the other one is related to local project review. How do we review project permit applications when they hit the permit counter? In Washington, the planning process, the legislative decisions, okay, the laws very heavily favor a broad array of participation in a very deliberative process. But once those decisions are made and you get to the local project review stage, Washington law very heavily favors finality and certainty and timelines, okay? Very heavily favors having a certain predictable permit process. That means that a lot of decisions that maybe in a different planning framework could easily be sort of kicked down the road and revisited in local project review. Washington does not allow a lot of those fundamental decisions, like whether this is the right density, whether this is the right use. Is this really where we want a subdivision to go? Washington law does not allow you to revisit those decisions when the permit hits the counter. A lot of that stuff, there's a lot more work that needs to be done up front, because once those decisions are made, they can't be revisited. So that's a particular feature of Washington's framework, and when you see things move forward, keep that in mind. Next slide. So Washington's planning law doesn't vary or doesn't apply the same across the state, and you'll see here there's roughly about 5 different flavors of GMA when you look at all the requirements read together. The larger metro counties have a fairly significantly more robust planning framework than the smaller rural counties do. And over time, sort of the difference between what a small rural county has to do and what a big metro county has to do, over time that gap has grown. There have been more requirements on the larger counties, and the amount of requirements that apply to the smaller counties have tended to go down. So there's quite a bit of difference in how the GMA actually applies. And one of the requirements, next slide, one of the requirements that we have that really what brings us here today is the requirement that you have a periodic update. Once you've adopted your plan, it doesn't sit on the shelf, okay? There's a requirement that every 10 years you have to go back and review your plan, and then, if necessary, revise and update your plan. So what are you revising it against? You're revising it against 2 basic things. The first one is, have there been any changes in state law since we last adopted our plan that we haven't folded into our plan and development regulations? That's the first thing, okay, changes in law. The second thing that you're reviewing it against is on-the-ground facts, okay? Have the facts on the ground changed since our last plan was adopted, okay? You're going to get a new forecast from OFM with a new population target, okay? You had a 20-year time horizon on your plan 10 years ago. Your periodic update is the point where you reset the clock for the next 20 years. You look back at what capital facilities you've built, which ones you thought you were going to build that you didn't build, how the market has responded in terms of growth to the plan you adopted last time, considering whether the the growth strategy you set last time is actually playing out the way you assumed it would when you adopted that plan. These are all the relevant facts, okay? So you're also reviewing your plan to see whether things have turned out the way we thought, and if not, what are we going to do different? So those are the two big things that define the periodic update. It's not just another annual amendment process. It is a much more complete review, because you're not looking and you're not essentially making a legislative decision just on those things that are in front of you, but you're making legislative decisions on things that may not necessarily be in front of you, but are a logical extension of either a duty to revise it to deal with new statutory changes, or changes in on-the-ground facts. Next slide. So here's a quick look at some of the most recent changes to the GMA. Last session was a big session. We're thinking this session might be a big one too. But this is an example of some of the changes that have happened just in the last year to the RCW. So these are the kind of new statutory changes that you'll be looking at. And one practice tip on some of these when you're doing your update, we'll talk a little bit later about the checklist that we have that local governments can use. So next slide. This is the overall process for the periodic update. So the first thing you do, really, and this is a really important step, create a work program to sort of plan out what kind of staff level work needs to occur. How many planning commission meetings do you have between now and when the update process finally ends? In some ways, that might be the most critical resource to manage, is how much time. We can hire planning consultants. You can't hire another planning commission. Okay, so think about how many meetings you have and fit that into your work, but have a good work program. Once you've done that, develop a community engagement plan, stuff like what we're doing today. City-county collaboration, do the review then of your existing regulations, talk about data gathering, start the EIS process, and you can see more. I hope you can read those as you move through some of these. You'll be doing staff reports, you'll be issuing public notices, you'll ultimately make a SEPA determination, you'll be setting that to Commerce for 60-day notice, then you'll be adopting the final one. And I've got a few of these in particular I want to highlight. Can you hit the next slide? Oh, no, it's showing. Go back. Right. So the first one, the review of the existing document, okay? One of the things we have available for local governments to use is we have a periodic update checklist, okay? When you're reviewing your plan and when you're reviewing your development and regulations, we really encourage you to use that checklist. It's really important to help you make sure you're not missing a spot. There's going to be a lot of big ticket items that you're going to be spending a lot of time talking about. The checklist will help make sure little things don't slip through the cracks. Second one is the adoption of the plan and regulations. So one of the things that's really critical when you're doing your adoptions associated with the periodic update process is your public notice and the recitals in the adopting ordinance need to specify that this is part of the periodic update process, okay? It needs to say that in the ordinance or resolution. If the county is ever challenged, one of the things that the Growth Management Hearings Board will use to determine whether something was or wasn't part of the update process is what they're going to look at. They're going to want to look at the public notice. Did you tell anyone that this was part of the update process? And they're going to want to look at the final adopting ordinance or resolution. Okay, make sure it specifies that this is part of the periodic update. And last one, when you finish the process, we really encourage, we'll be working with you throughout their process, but we really encourage that you send us a formal written notice that our city or our county considers the update process complete. One of our duties as a state agency is to keep track of who's finished the update process and who hasn't finished the update process. And it's not our decision as to whether your update is complete. That's your decision. But we really ask you, and we really strongly advise that when you do decide, yeah, we're done, this is it, that you notify us so we can mark you as complete on our list. Next slide. So the decisions you're making at any one time in the planning process, they're not one decision. They're always a set of nested decisions. Okay, so they build on the work that's already happened, and they build to the work that you're doing forward. One of the things that we often hear as a frustration from members of the public when they come to talk about a planning process is, why are we talking to you about that decision was already made? You've already made up your mind on what you're going to do. I bet you've heard that before if you've been to a public hearing or two, okay? There's a little bit of truth to that every time. Why? Because no decision is never made in a vacuum. So it's always important to remember, okay, what is this decision that we're actually making today, okay? What kind of discretion is the governing body actually exercising, and what things have already been decided? What's already been set in motion, or what is a decision that was made by the legislature or some other organization, or what decision just naturally falls out of facts? There's only so much money, okay? Those kind of things. So keep that in mind. But they'll fall into a process. In your process for this periodic update, you're going to be talking about countywide planning policies. You're going to be doing allocation of the growth target. You're going to need to do different kinds of analysis, like a housing needs analysis or a land capacity analysis. You're going to be developing an overall growth strategy for how we're going to make sure that we have the land capacity and the development capacity we need to accommodate the population that we think is going to come. And then you need to have your capital facilities plan to make sure that you have a financially realistic way to pay for the facilities and services that you need to make your growth strategy work. But these decisions are all nested decisions, okay? And they flow from each other. So the countywide planning policies, next slide. The countywide planning policies are where the city and the county work out a series of policies together that are going to govern how regional coordination occurs. So they'll cover things like how do we review the urban growth boundary? How do we set the growth targets? What does regional transportation planning look like? How are we going to manage essential public facilities, those things that everyone needs but nobody wants to live next to? These are all the things that you will find in countywide planning policies. And that sort of forms the foundation for what moves forward. Next. Next slide. So the next thing that you'll need to do is you'll need to figure out how much population do we think is actually coming, okay? What's the control total we're going to be working for? When we're doing a 20-year plan for the community, what's the population? So Washington law requires that you use the OFM forecast as the basis for establishing your growth targets, okay? But the OFM forecast, it doesn't give you one number. It gives you a range of numbers. And the best way to think about a forecast is anywhere it falls along that line, that's not one number. That's always a probability distribution around that number, okay? So there's the high, there's the medium, and there's the low, okay? But when you actually look in the past, one of the things that's going to come up is, well, where do we fit within that range? How much, can we decide to go anywhere in that range? Is anywhere just fine? Well, as is true with most probability distributions, it's pretty close to the middle, all right? And if you really want to know how much weight to give to the OFM forecast and that medium number, look to the forecasts from the past 20 years and what they told you about your population was going to be today. Every time I've looked at it, it's been within 1 or 2% of the OFM medium. It's scary good. So there's a really big range that's specified in those numbers, but OFM medium is actually really, really close most of the time. You're going to probably be within 1% of OFM median, so 1 to 2% of the OFM medium. So I would strongly encourage that you start with that process. Don't spend a whole lot of time and avoid the edges of that. The other thing to remember about forecasts is, why do we forecast something to begin with? We forecast something because we can't control it directly, and it's going to affect the decisions we make. So when you're thinking about your forecast, think about that. It's not about deciding how much growth we want to come. That's not something we can control directly. That's why we use a forecast, okay? It's about figuring out what is most likely and working from there. Next slide. So these are some of the critical questions you're going to make of any forecast, okay? Are we asking, does it answer the right questions? What are the unstated assumptions? What's the range of foreseeable results? And then how do you manage that uncertainty, okay? Make sure you're using consistent assumptions across the plan. So if you figured out this is our growth strategy, make sure that you don't have one population that's covered in your land use element and another that you're using for your regional transportation plan. Make sure you're using consistent assumptions. Make sure you're checking back. Look back every 5 years ago to see if you're on track. These are the kind of things you can do to manage the uncertainty associated with any forecast. So, next slide. So the next step that you'll do once you've got your OFM, once you've got your forecast for the whole county, then the next question comes, well, where is that going to go? Okay, you need to get to an individual growth target for the county incorporated area and the individual cities then, okay? That's the target allocation process where you take the overall number and determine, okay, what's going to be the growth target for Vancouver? What's going to be the growth target for Camas? That's the process that cities and counties go through when they're developing that, and that's where that final number comes from. You'll use that number then as the control total in what's called the housing needs analysis, where you determine how do we translate the population into dwelling units, and you look at things like, well, how many of the dwelling units we need, what's the balance of single family versus multifamily that we think we ought to need. That's the process of doing the housing needs analysis. Next slide. So something that's new this year, okay, and new for this update cycle, is the housing needs analysis. Your targets, they need to be sub-aggregated by price, by income band. So you need to make sure that you're not just planning for an overall number of housing units, but you need to make sure you're providing or you're planning for housing units at a variety of different income bands to make sure that everyone in the community has an opportunity for a home that they can afford. So that's an additional step that's now required with new changes to the housing element process. And this is something that every county in Washington is going to be going through now, is going to be making sure that your housing element is drilling down a little bit in terms of the type of housing that's being provided and who it's affordable for. Okay, Commerce is in the process right now of producing some preliminary allocations that counties and cities can use to this process to make, as a starting point. But this is the process that's coming along, and this is the first update cycle planning for housing affordability has to occur at this level. Next slide. The next part of the process then will be looking at your growth strategy. This is going to be a big part of what goes on when you're doing your environmental impact statement on your comprehensive plan update. And I'm going to give you a specific practice tip that's really critical when you're looking at your growth strategy. One of the things that's tempting to do when you're setting the alternatives is to set an alternative that's like a high growth, a medium growth, and a low growth alternative. That's a really tempting way to do it. The problem is you're going to spend a few $100,000 to tell you something I could tell her to tell you, all right? More growth means there's more impact, less growth means there's less impact. Not only does it tell you something that you already knew, but it's also setting alternatives you don't have that much control over. It's really fundamental that you take wherever you think your forecasted population is and use that as the control total that represents the purpose and need, the reason why we're doing it, as they call it in SEPA land, so that your different alternatives are different ways of accommodating the same amount of growth, okay? That's a really important practice tip for making sure that when you do your environmental impact statement, it's actually getting at the policy choices you have and is actually drawing attention to the things that you can control directly. Next slide. So once you get into the development of a comprehensive plan, what does that comprehensive plan actually look like? This is what you'll find in a comprehensive plan. You'll find that there's different elements. These are the ones required in the Growth Management Act. And then within each one of those elements, you'll find there's things like goals and policies, all right? That's the compelling part of the plan. Then you'll find there's analytical work, the staff work, the things you pay the consultants all the big bucks to do, the inventories of things, all right, the inventory of the transportation system. Then you'll find an analysis and conclusions, okay? What level of service are we going to set? What are we going to need? What are the gaps between what we need and what we have? That's the next part of it, okay? And then the last part of it is the specific part, right? The strategies and commitments. What are we going to do to make sure, given what we know, how we achieve our objectives? So that's the strategies and commitments. And if you look to any one of the elements, you'll find this in the statute. This is the basic structure of it. Next slide. So this is what it looks like for capital facilities and transportation. You've got your inventory of what do we own, what do we need that other people own, what's our forecast? Okay, that's your transportation model. How much growth are we going to have? Where do we think it's going to go? Okay. What are we planning for? Then you've got your identification of system needs. That's where you look at what do we need to make sure we're investing in to continue to maintain the system we have? What do you need to correct any existing deficiencies, safety problems or environmental problems, chronic repair problems we have with our existing system? Okay, it's not related to any new growth, but we know we need to replace this bridge sometime, right? That's existing deficiencies. And then you've got what do we need to accommodate future growth, okay? Based on our growth strategy, based on what's in our land use element, what do we need to cover those bets, okay? That's the identification of system needs. And then the financing plan. How are we going to finance this? Given what we know today about our revenue, given the tax base that's represented by the new growth that's coming, do we have enough revenue to cover the facilities that we need, okay? And if not, there needs to be a feedback loop, not only back into the needs process, but it needs to go all the way back into the growth strategy process, okay? In many ways, you might find that the biggest control total on your growth strategy is not your OFM forecast, it's your ability to serve new areas. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about this. So let's imagine you've got a new area that you're building, okay? It represented by that big green square, okay? So you start building houses, maybe you build the gray one. Can you really tell the difference between the gray and the blue on there? Okay, let's start with every other one. Okay, those are gray. You start by building those, okay? What have you got to do to those? You've got to put the line in, okay? And that line represents the street. It also represents the water line, the sewer line, where the school buses are going to have to run. A lot of costs that the cities and counties have can be represented by that street in front of the house. So don't think it's just filling the potholes, it's the whole thing that's underneath that street, okay? So once you put in half of those houses, okay, you've already made those investments, right? So anything else you add along that line, the marginal cost of adding one more house along that line is substantially smaller than the marginal cost of building the road to the first place, okay? So that big box down at the end, that represents a retail establishment, okay? So that goes in, you've paid for the streets, you've paid for the sewer and the water to cover that, okay? Now, if that store closes, right, what happens to your cost? What happens to the cost for the sewer and the water and the streets? It doesn't change, right? Okay? The store's gone, right? The tax base is gone, but their costs are gone. Your costs are not, right? You've got the carrying costs on all that infrastructure. So when you're thinking about your growth strategy, think you don't buy cities by the house, you buy it by the acre, okay? The cost of accommodating a particular housing unit inside the area you've already made investments in sewer and water and roads is significantly smaller than the cost associated with adding new land to the urban area, okay? That's a significant difference in cost. And those costs represent risks, okay? And I think there's a common misconception oftentimes that when development comes in, that the development pays for everything, right? Most developers can't afford to pay for everything themselves, okay? They usually do require some partnership and investment, just so it can be affordable. Otherwise, no one can afford to buy it. But even best case scenario, even if they did pay for the whole thing, remember, you now own it, right? That means you are responsible for maintaining it. You'll be ultimately responsible for replacing it. So a free road is not a free lunch. It's a free puppy, okay? That's yours now. So that's why it's so important. Remember back to my original presentation about the values, intention, and certainty and predictability? That means the best time for you to start asking yourself questions about whether or not you can pay for it and whether or not this is going to cover its cost is when you're looking at the comprehensive plan. Once you've made that decision, once the zoning is there, okay, that's largely an irreversible decision. You wrote a check for all the infrastructure associated with providing the adequate public facilities. So this is a slide. This is a graphic that a guy named Joe Minicosi did. He's probably one of the best consultants in the whole country looking at this issue. He did this for the city of Lafayette, Louisiana. Next slide. I'm sorry, I'm ahead of myself. And it shows, okay, how many fire hydrants did they have per person in 1949? They had 2.4 fire hydrants, which they just used fire hydrants because it was easy to count. And it's a pretty good proxy for the size of your water system, okay? So they had 2.4 fire hydrants per person back in 1949. Remember, this was before World War II, before Fannie Mae, before massive state and federal infrastructure funding, back when everyone had to pay cash for stuff, okay? 2015, where they are today, they were wondering, why are we going broke? Why can't we afford our infrastructure, okay? The difference between growth of people and the growth of population. They now had 51.3 fire hydrants per person. That's how much faster the size of their infrastructure obligation grew relative to the size of their tax base. Okay, that was just a really good proxy for what that looks like. If you're really interested in digging into this stuff, go ahead and look at Urban 3. I'm not getting any advertising revenue from him. It's just some of the best work I've seen. But this is really an important thing to remember, okay? Understand the difference between fixed costs and marginal costs. Oftentimes we tend to use average costs, but what we really need to be paying attention to is marginal cost. What is the cost of the next unit given a specific location? What's it costing us to hold a piece of infrastructure even if no one's using it? And then what does it cost to extend something out from the urban edge? That's the extension costs. And all of these numbers are going to be really a little bit different. But some key, next slide. Here's some key things to remember, especially around capital facilities. Okay, make sure there's a good feedback loop between your capital facility planning process and your land use planning process and your approval process, okay? Make sure that you really understand and you're really paying attention to what it costs to serve and when new infrastructure is going to come online. The most important thing for an elected official is when they're thinking about planning that you're not thinking like a regulator. You're thinking like an equity partner, okay? You own the infrastructure that's necessary to serve your community, okay? You need to be paying attention to what is the tax base that's coming back and how does that compare to what the costs are going to be. The other thing to remember is when you're talking about demand of different things, okay, how people respond, location is as important as design. It's actually fundamentally more important from design. Generally speaking, when you're talking about funding, some quick rules of thumb, make sure you're funding maintenance on your existing system before you talk about adding to it. Talk about working out from the center, okay? Because then you're spending most of your money on things that probably you need to update anyway. Even if you have to upgrade a water line or a sewer line, if you're doing it in the old neighborhoods of town, that thing's probably 100 years old. You're going to have to replace that anyway, okay? So as long as you have to replace it, money spent on replacing it or upgrading it is not adding to your maintenance obligation. So work out from the center, favor upgrading versus adding new. And lastly, next slide. After this is all done, we then get into the process of implementing your comprehensive plan, both in your capital facility plans on an ongoing basis and in your development regulations and the way you administer those things. These are now the process of implementing their plans. Okay, and as you're working through, you'll need to make sure that your development regulations are consistent with and implement your plan. Next slide. So that's where we are. I'm going to leave you with some specific recommendations that I touched on today that I think are some of the most important things. If you only take a few things out of this, the first one, use the OFM medium, okay? Just using that, and we'll spend you a lot of time, we'll save you a lot of time arguing about where you should fall within the range. You'll be pretty close to dead on in 20 years, unless things got really weird. Second, when you're doing your alternatives analysis, make sure that your population and employment targets are the same across all three scenarios. And lastly, use your ability to adequately finance public facilities as a control total on your growth strategy, okay? You'll find out, start with the inventory, okay? Figure out where in my community I can already serve. I already have the infrastructure in place. And start with the question of, can I accommodate my growth target within the area I'm already serving, okay? Use that as a control total on your overall growth strategy. Make sure you can afford it. That will be, you'll be glad you did in 20 years, trust me. So with that, appreciate your time today. We're looking forward to working with you throughout the process. Catherine is going to be working with the county staff on an ongoing basis. We're only a phone call away, and I hope we get to keep working with you on this, and thank you again for having me here today.